Have you ever met a killer? Tonight, we are going to read the most frightening responses across the web. About 12 years ago, I was in my early 20s and living in a southern state in the US. Late one night, I realized I urgently needed to buy something, and so I went to the only store near me I knew was open, a Walmart supercenter that was open 24/7. This store is right off a major US interstate exit, I-85, and it was a weekday around 1 a.m. in the morning when I was at the store. The parking lot of this store is huge, and often truckers, big rigs, would park their trucks in the lot overnight, along with some random campers and RVs. I was in line to check out and immediately noticed the man in front of me. The store was otherwise almost empty. He was a youngish white guy, average build, maybe 30s. He was hunched over, with a baseball cap bunched down over much of his face. He purchased these items: a shovel, 3-pack of duct tape, rope, a set of zip ties, a box of latex gloves, a pair of leather gloves, an empty gas container, the red plastic kind, and a disposable cell phone, one of those track phone type things. He seemed to be unwilling to engage with the checkout person, who also seemed annoyed to be working at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday. Fair enough. He paid in cash. Now, even if he wasn't buying those items, I think I would have felt creeped out. There was something just off about the situation to me. I know that sounds crazy, but I just sensed something wrong. But to buy those specific items together, and nothing else, to buy them at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, and to pay cash. I waited in the store for a long time and asked the assistant night manager to walk me to my car, which she didn't want to do, but finally agreed. The next day I called the local FBI field office and reported the situation. The people taking the complaint asked me repeatedly if I was calling in response to a specific crime, creepiness. But took my information. Didn't hear of anything or see anything on the news that caused alarm. Then, a few months later, the FBI local office reached back out to me to ask if I paid with a credit card at Walmart. I did. I never heard from them again. I have no idea who the man was, what he was doing, who he may have harmed, or where he did it. I don't know if he's been captured or not, but I'm pretty darn sure I witnessed someone buying things to murder someone else. Story 2. My mom worked as the night auditor at a hotel where Neil Falls was often the only other employee present. He was the security guard. I only met him once in passing, but she worked with him every night. Falls turned out to be a maniac serial killer who was murdering escorts across the country, and ultimately was done in by one in a pretty epic and TV movie-worthy struggle. She fought him off with a rake while he was trying to strangle her. He put his gun down for a second to try and grab the rake, and she grabbed the gun and shot behind her, blowing his brains out. Cops found all sorts of crazy murder shit in his car. Not exactly the kind of story you expect to read about a coworker. Story 3. Myself and 6 friends, aged 18-28, mixed European group, were on a 5-day river canoe trip up a tributary of the Orinoco around Merida in Venezuela in 1998. Our guides were an older, 60s, rough-looking German guy and a slightly younger but shifty-looking Orinoco Basin Indian. One of our group knew fluent German, but for some unexplained reason didn't share with the guide that she could speak it. Later told us she didn't want the creepy dude making comments to her that no one else could understand. We were 3 days in, roughing it in hammocks on the side of the river, not having seen a village for at least 8 hours. The guides kind of kept themselves to themselves after dinner, which was fine. But this evening, they were a bit further away, and we could tell they were having a pretty heated discussion in a mix of German and local dialect. Suddenly, the German girl in the group turns white and looks terrified, and it takes us a few minutes to calm her down. She explained she heard the German guy talk about making sure the others will be at the place, and they will have the guns, and that the crocodiles will get rid of the guys and the girls will go with them to some village the day after next. We kind of freaked out, but decided that being alone with these 2 dudes days from anywhere in the middle of the fucking rainforest, we were pretty much trapped. We decided on a plan, which, fortunately, went our way. Early the next day, we decided that the next time we saw another canoe expedition pass us, we would essentially shout and scream at them that we were being kidnapped and needed help. Fortunately, a 4-canoe group came past and we enacted our plan. Our guides immediately just got the fuck out of there. Didn't even protest about our crazy accusations or anything, other than to pull a sawn-off 12-gauge from under a blanket and pointed at us to stop us chasing them, which kind of validated to us that they were planning to traffic us, and they didn't. We got taken to the nearest village a few hours down a branching tributary, where we explained the situation to the local police and some soldiers that were on exercise or something. Turns out there was a suspected serial killer operating out of the Maracaibo area targeting tourists going into the forest, active since 1996. I was never able to corroborate any of the info we were told by the police using any Western media source or internet searches. We still occasionally email each other about our close call, but it's been 20 years and we've moved on with our lives. I've never told family or my wife, and I don't think anyone else ever told more than a handful of people. Story 4. I'll do you one better. I had a serial killer live in my basement for a couple months. Little over 10 years ago, my mom and I lived in an old apartment building with a shared storage space in the basement for the residents. One winter, we found a homeless man in our storage area. He seemed like a nice enough guy. Didn't seem to be an addict or anything. So we told him he could stay the winter down there if he wanted, but he had to be out by spring. We brought him some canned food and toiletries and pulled out an old mattress we had and some blankets. He was extremely grateful and even pulled out an old snow shovel and shoveled the driveway and sidewalk for us. Come spring, he was gone, just like he promised. We spent the next few weeks feeling pretty good about ourselves, glad we were able to help a guy in a tough situation. Then, a few weeks later, as we were watching the morning news, we hear a story that a suspect in the recent rape and murder of 3 older women in the area had been arrested, and a picture of our former guest pops up. We were dumbfounded. We waited for the police to show up and question us, but they never did, and we never contacted them either. But we should have. My mom was pretty freaked out and just wanted to wash her hands of the experience, but I don't think we were really in any kind of danger. All 3 victims were elderly women who lived alone in relatively isolated areas. A middle-aged woman and a 16-year-old male living in an apartment building in the middle of downtown is a lot riskier target and not even close to the profile of the previous victims. Still, it was a wild experience and makes for an interesting story. Story 5. When I was 9 years old, my childhood best friend and her alcoholic father were over at my parents' duplex, also alcoholics, and this was common. This night her dad had been at a bar during the day while the 2 of us were at school, and he had picked up a friend while drinking and brought him go pick us up and then over to my home that evening. They spent the evening partying while my friend and I played as kids do, and by the end of the night, when her dad and his friend were ready to leave, we both begged our parents to let her stay the night. My mom said no for whatever reason. She spent the night on school nights a lot, so it was rare for her to say no, so we switched it up and asked if I could go to hers instead. Green light from her dad and my mom, but my step said no, and that was that. She left with her dad and the friend. I never saw her again. The friend was a deranged man, out of prison on parole, for aggravated assault, I believe. He went with them back to their house to continue the party, and the following day offered to drive my friend to school. Her dad allowed it. The guy kidnapped her, sexually assaulted her, murdered her, and then tried to burn her body in an abandoned trailer. It was only a few days before she was discovered, and he was caught. To think how differently it could have gone haunts me. What if she had been allowed to stay the night? Would she be alive today? What if I had been allowed to stay the night there? Would I be dead too? This event has shaped my life in a very negative way. I grew up terrified of everything. I suffer extreme paranoia and anxiety. I think of her every day. Story 6. Journalist at a local newspaper doing the Sunday evening shift. Got a call about a guy whose car had been hijacked with his 2-year-old son in it. I met him at the police station to interview him, get a pic of the kid so we could publish and ask people to be on the lookout, etc. The man was devastated. I'd been a journalist for years, traveled all over. I was no pushover, and generally really good at reading people. This man was clearly in a state. I had a hard time staying professional and not bawling my eyes out in front of him. At the end of the interview, I clasped his hands tightly, trying to convey how awful I found his situation to be. I told him all I could do was write the best story possible. Maybe someone would read it, see the pic, and help find the kid. I didn't sleep that night. The next day off after weekend shift, one of my colleagues phoned me. They'd found the body of the little boy at a rubbish dump, and they'd arrested his father for the murder. He'd had issues with the boy's mother, so murdered his own son out of spite or something. I don't know. I don't want to know. He made up the story of the hijacking. All I know is I shook the same hands that had killed a little boy. I cried for him while he just played me, knowing he'd killed his son just hours before. That haunted me for years. Story 7. I was waiting for a night bus by myself in the early hours of the morning. This guy came up to me and started talking to me, and I could instantly tell something was off with him. I wasn't too worried as there were a couple of other people at the bus stop, and I knew I didn't have long to wait until my bus anyway. He was asking me questions about my life, which I was obviously trying not to answer, asking where I live, who I was with, etc. And after about 10 minutes also mentioned that he wasn't waiting for a bus. Okay. Then he took his hat off and asked if I liked it. I said sure. He proceeded to tell me that every time he kills somebody, he buys himself a new hat. Okay, what the fuck? I'm now on high alert and freaking out, so I just nod and don't say anything. I guess that took the kid as disbelief because he leant in closer to me and said, I have my wife tied to my bed right now. Okay, fuck this. I saw a bus coming. It wasn't mine, but I hopped on anyway just to get away. It was very crowded on the bus, so I make my way to the front and look behind me to see the guy following me onto the bus. I'm losing my shit by this point because I now know that he's following me. Then, just as the bus doors were about to close, somebody else gave him a hard shove, and he fell out of the bus. I honestly could have cried with relief. The guy who shoved him off came up to me after and told me he'd been at the bus stop and had heard everything the guy had been saying to me. I still think about that night sometimes and wonder if I was talking to an actual killer or just some London weirdo with a few screws loose, and it weirds me out that I'll... Story 8. My great uncle. He went to war in 1940 and found out he really enjoyed killing people. Spent the next 30-odd years hopping around the world as a mercenary, mainly in Africa. Only met him at weddings and funerals, but as a small kid, he'd tell some horrifically inappropriate war stories. There were many, but one sticks in my mind about how he caught a suspected spy on a raid, so they dragged him across the bush back to base tied by his ankles to the back of a jeep. He laughingly told me how there wasn't much left by the time they got back. Guy was a stone-cold psychopath. Story 9. My mom in her late teens, early 20s, living in the GTA, Toronto. Around the time the Scarborough rapist, Paul Bernardo, was active. My mom told me that during this time, women in the area, including herself, were super paranoid about being victimized. One night she was on the subway and a young guy was sitting across from her who she noticed kept staring at her. She felt uncomfortable, especially due to her paranoia, and decided to test her gut feeling by standing up. He stood up too. She quickly sat down and tried it one more time before the next stop. Again, he got up when she did. Eventually, her stop came up and she decided to get off. The guy got off too, and she said she immediately knew something bad would happen. He started following her and she bolted. She got lucky as she crossed the middle of the street because a bunch of vehicles passed and he couldn't cross, and she never saw him again. My mom told me that when Paul Bernardo was caught, my mom saw his picture in the news and felt chills. He was the guy on the subway. When I saw pictures of his victims, I also felt chills because when my mom was in her 20s, she looked exactly like Kristen French. It's pretty scary. We still live in the GTA, and recently, he was denied parole. Story 10. Freshman year of college, I was in a very small English class. It was a super small class, so we got pretty comfortable with each other. A couple months into the semester, a 10-year-old girl was kidnapped and later found murdered. It was a major news story in Colorado. The biggest shock was finding out that the killer, Austin, was in my English class. Before he was arrested, We had done a class review of people's papers, and my professor pulled my classmate's essay up on the projector. It was odd, though, because his papers were usually well written, but this was full of grammatical and spelling errors and fragmented ideas going nowhere. Austin told us he was sorry about all the mistakes and that the draft was rushed because he was busy and couldn't focus. After he was arrested, a classmate realized that was a day or two after she was kidnapped and murdered. One day, me and him had walked together to our cars and had a discussion about morality and religion. That conversation stuck with me a lot, especially when some more details of his life and what led up to the murder came out. I still get an icky feeling about it. Story 11. When I was a teenager, I had a coworker who was pretty sketchy. She looked like a sweetheart, but I quickly learned she was impulsive and quick to angry. Luckily, she liked me. She spent hours one New Year's Eve curling my hair, and she offered me a job with her old boss, a drug dealer. But it's the thought that counts, right? None of her stories about her own past lined up, and she told everyone a different story about the massive scar on her neck. She wasn't somebody I trusted for sure. Maybe a year or so after the last time I saw her, I overheard an old mutual coworker talking about freaked out he was about someone he knew getting arrested. I asked who he was talking about, and he told me that this girl had stabbed a couple of guys to death and tried to set another one on fire. She'd gone apeshit on some poor cab driver and a college professor for no real reason. She'd also knocked one of her friends out of his wheelchair, doused him in lighter fluid, and then couldn't get her lighter to work. We found out later that she was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murders. Even stranger, years later, I ended up working with one of her victim's best friends. This coworker once told me a story about his professor friend, and then mentioned that the man had been brutally murdered. I recognized the circumstances of the crime and confirmed it was the same guy. This wasn't some small town either. Crazy how connected we can be sometimes. Story 12. Back in college, I met a guy who did 24 years in prison for a daylight hate crime. A few months after he was allowed to live on his own again, he moved in across the alley from my friend's place and came over to talk to us on the porch one day. Out of the blue, mid-conversation, he started talking about the time he spent in prison for killing a black man. Later, his wife came outside and confirmed the story and asked us what he said about it. I guess he was a participant in a gang of white supremacists who beat this other man to death. He expressed regret and sounded like a person confused and lost on account of that action. But it was a shockingly barbaric thing to hear this man admit to. It was really uncomfortable. Story 13. Grew up and spent most of my life in a small city in Germany's east. We had a prison in town, built in the 1850s, later used by the Nazis and GDR Gov to get political opponents out of public and whatnot, which was straight up a freaking fortress. It was relatively small, so when Germany reunited, they decided to use it as a high-security prison for the worst of the baddies of our state. Back then, my mom was a nurse anesthetist, and she met them all. Every time a detainee needed medical help, they were taken to the hospital, and many of them weren't too happy, especially not when nurses and doctors all were women. The easiest way to get them down is a little injection. Like everything in a small former GDR city, the hospital was quite tiny too, and so my mom was almost always the one who had the honor to give them the shot and talk to them. They were all bad, but the ones who stood out the most were definitely the murderers. They were openly talking about it, detailed, and without emotion. Some case that I still have in mind. Case 1. Back in the 70s to 90s, the GDR and Vietnam had quite good relationships, and Vietnamese workers came to Germany. The war was just over, and many still struggled with psychological problems as an aftermath. 2 of these were a young couple. They arrived in the 80s, opened a store and restaurant, and really just lived a normal life. They had 3 kids. One day, out of nowhere, in the middle of the night, the husband stabs his wife and 2 of the 3 children. Only their son survives. I later became friends with him. Case 2. A couple in their 50s, married for decades. One day, the wife comes home from work and catches her husband with another woman. She goes outside, grabs an axe, beheads both of them. After that, she leaves the house to cut some wood for the oven, cooks herself a last meal in freedom, and calls the police. Case 3. a little village outside of town. Not much going on there. People know each other and are living the typical villager life. One day, a 20-year-old girl disappears without a trace. As the relationship between her and her family wasn't good, they assumed she ran away or was hidden by her boyfriend. Not much happening during the next months, until one day one of her neighbors was found guilty of the rape and torturing of his ex-wife. In his kitchen, police finds the phone of the missing girl. In his nightstand, her bracelet. They searched the house and found pieces of her body hidden in a clay wall in the man's basement. She was raped, tortured, and killed. Today, the prison is closed and on sale. Story 14. When I was in about 7th grade, I had this huge crush on one of my neighbor's friends, Jay Dornkawi and Tran. He was a couple years ahead of me and beautiful. I used to talk about him all the time, and he lived in my neighborhood, so I low-key stalked him by riding my bike past his house every day. Anyway, he was funny and charming, and was showing off, I guess, by breaking the lock off my parents' cable box out front. They never noticed, and someone changed it back one day. I think notes were exchanged by us at some point. This was before kids had cell phones. Definitely stupid stuff. Anyway, I remember being horrified when I saw his mugshot on the front page a few weeks later. He had killed his coworker at Safeway, who he felt was a romantic rival for some girl I'd never heard of. Devastating part for me at the time. I wasn't secretly the love of his life, but basically he lured the guy out to the woods in his car, and then slit his throat and stepped on his throat until he stopped gurgling. Chilling. He went to prison and might even be out by now. I still sometimes drive by his place when I'm visiting my folks, even though his family sold it not long after the murder. It's been almost 20 years, and I still can't reconcile the version of Jay I knew with what happened out there in the woods that day. Unrelated to the above case, 2 years later, I went out with a boy who was in my grade, going out dating exclusively. It was a stupid winter relationship that lasted 2 weeks, and he abruptly ended it for reasons I don't remember. Later that summer, I remember hearing that he'd murdered a beautiful waitress he'd just met. He'd taken her up to a bridge in the early morning and beat her, and cut her throat. Then he threw her off the bridge. The guy I dated was a nerd who liked to play basketball at his church and was in honor society with me. He was so nice he'd ask if he could hold my hand, and he never raised his voice or even say negative things. Just be positive, bro, fist bump. I was never able to picture him even squashing a bug. It still blows my mind. Neither of these murders were contested. I believe both confessed, and no trials were necessary. There isn't a question as to whether they did it. This is why I automatically tune out whenever anyone offers their experience with a person as evidence that the person isn't capable of XYZ. You don't ever really know what a person is capable of. It totally depends on which side they show you. Which is why I always assume my date intends to murder me.